I run in conservative, pro-life circles, and a lot of people who just said there's not much I like about Donald Trump said, but judges. It almost became a punchline, right? But judges. And so that's what we're up here to talk about. Donald Trump has gotten, 110 district court judges confirmed, 42 circuit court, that's the appellate court, obviously 2 Supreme Court justices. He's remaking it. He's flipped a handful of circuits that are now majority conservative. And but it's not just Donald Trump. If you guys remember, if you write trivia, the category I had Mick America Great Again, about all the Micks who are changing the country. Here I think we need to talk about McConnell and Mick Gann. And the guy who knows the story best is Fred Barnes. So Fred, tell us sort of the story of how these 152 have gotten there.
Well, the truth is there are 2 parts of it. One is the Supreme Court justices, the 2 that we know so well. And then there are, the second most important part is the 43 appeals court judges that have been appointed and confirmed to the federal appeals courts. And then there are the district court judges, which are less important from a political standpoint. There's more, the senators have some say in who becomes a district court judge, the lowest level in the federal judiciary. That includes some Democratic senators, so they are less political. You'll remember, I suspect, since most of you all followed the campaign pretty closely, the 2016 campaign, that judges came up in March of 2016 when Donald Trump came to Washington and met with a number of people. And the result of it was that he would come out with a list of about 10 people who would be potential Supreme Court nominees by President Trump. It was a pretty impressive list, I'll have to say. And as I recall, neither Neil Gorsuch or Kavanaugh were on that list. There was a later list that came out, and they finally got on it, on the list. But that was for Supreme Court justices. And I'll get back to that in a minute, and I know Ken will want to talk about it as well. But the planning in picking appeals court judges turned out to be extraordinarily important. And Tim mentioned 2 of the people that were so important. One is Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. The other is Don McGahn, who was in effect a McConnell appointee, but he became the White House counsel. And then there was Leonard Leo, the head of the Federalist Society, this booming organization of conservative lawyers and judges and so on, which is it's only about 20 years old or something like that.
It's actually earlier. It's founded at the time of the Reagan administration, so
Okay.
it's 30.
Well, it's picked up steam since then, for sure. There was a visit by McConnell to the White House to visit with Don McGahn, the White House counsel. Now, McConnell had a lot to do with appointing him because he'd known him when McCann, who was sort of an elections lawyer, but had been the chairman of the Federal Election Commission, which is a horrible body that shouldn't exist probably, and there's every reason to get rid of it. But he was pretty good at cutting down on the wrongdoing that organization could do. Excuse me a minute while I cough.
I was going to say the general rule is if it's got 3 letters, it's based in Washington, and particularly if one of the letters is F for federal, it probably shouldn't exist. That's a good rule. But while you drink that, I'm going to tell you a quick story. Don McGahn, I ran into him at the Republican convention, and I told him, I said, I don't know if Trump's going to be a conservative president if he wins. And McGahn said, Trump is going to make the federal bench much more conservative because he's a Republican and he's going to listen to people like me and Leonard Leo. And I thought he was bragging, but
I was a little unsure of it too, and because in the beginning there was just a list, And Trump, later in the campaign, I forget exactly when, sometime in the summer, maybe it was the early fall, said, not only is there a list, but I will choose my Supreme Court nominee, at least the first one, from this list. And later, after he was president, of course, he said, well, when he got to another one, a second Supreme Court nominee, he would do the same thing, choose from the list, which had been increased in number and had gotten some new people on it. But anyway, they had one thing in common: conservative records. Now, the appeals court judges were a little different. One, there were a lot of vacancies, and two, they had a specific thing they wanted. But I was going to mention this visit of Mitch McConnell to the White House in the first week of the Trump presidency. He didn't bother with meeting with Trump. He went to see Don McGahn, who on judges was the guy to talk to at the White House. And what he said was, look, forget about the Justice Department. If you bring them in on this judicial selection stuff, it'll just confuse things, it'll delay it, there'll be arguments, let's just leave them out. And so they did. They left the Justice Department out. So it was McConnell, to a lesser extent, Chuck Grassley, who was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Leonard Leo, who had a lot to do with coming up with the names of people who were selected for these judgeships. There were two things they were looking for. They were looking for judges who were conservative and, in the most cases, originalists. And I'm sure Ken Starr can give you a brief definition of what an originalist is. I've tried to define it in a couple of things I've written. I'm not sure whether I really got it, but anyway. And secondly, one of the things they wanted to fill these vacancies on the appeals court were judges who would be as young as possible. And
I thought they should have just stood outside of Notre Dame Law School on graduation day.
Well, they have gotten a few, and of course they may get more. But anyway, they did a pretty good job at that. And sort of, I guess about the oldest they got were ones maybe in their early 50s, and that was sort of the as far as they wanted to go at the end. A few months ago, they nominated a 36-year-old lawyer, a woman who worked at Williams and Connolly in Washington, the big law firm there. And there was a third thing that turned out to be, and this was McConnell's doing. You had a very, very small Republican margin in the Senate. You couldn't allow dissenting votes because you'd lose. And when, of course, there were a couple of examples, more than a couple, maybe 3 or 4 examples of potential nominees who were going to get dissenting votes.
Lose
that
Susan
they had
Collins.
to not nominate them.
People they would lose Susan Collins, or who were they?
Well, yeah, Susan Collins or somebody like that. Susan Collins, they usually talked into getting this was a McConnell specialty, talking to Susan Collins to get her to vote for conservative judges who were also had taken controversial social issue cases like the gay marriage and things like that. So they got around this just sending up a stream of appeals court judges over the entire period now so far of the Obama Trump administration. Yeah, I get to Trump. Yeah, the Trump administration.
He was going in his mind from George Washington and counting up.
I remember him, Trump, and the Trump administration, and they pretty much filled all the vacancies. Now, there are 1 or 2 left, and McConnell would like to fill them, but may or may not. They have done a fantastic job, and McConnell has done a fantastic job of holding all the Republicans, all the Senate Republicans, to vote with virtually no dissenting votes. And so this 36-year-old woman who was, I think some of the senators thought was a little young to be going on the appeals court, they all voted for her. Now, I'll mention one other thing. When they were looking for to pick judges, and not Supreme Court judges, but these are the appeals court judges. Remember how important the appeals courts are. You know, this is These are the minor leagues for people who are being judges and maybe picked for, to the Supreme Court, as both Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh were appeals court judges. So what were they looking for? Now, in the earlier, conservatives would look to people who had been law clerks of Justice Scalia. Made sense. Well, of course, Scalia died famously in February of 2016, and McConnell said he would not allow that vacancy to be filled with the last year of Obama's administration, or the last 11 months, and they would. And so the next president, the American people would decide who the next president would select. And it turned out to be Neil Gorsuch. So who were they looking for? As again, they were looking for the youngest possible judges for the appeals courts, and also for the Supreme Court for that matter, because they would be on the court longer and have a longer impact on the country and the judicial system and America in general. And secondly, one of the things they looked for in particular was nominees who had been law clerks for Clarence Thomas. Now, this was new, that Clarence Thomas was bringing in these law clerks that were very talented and smart and conservative enough. They've gotten a bunch of them. And I think this is one of the great successes and a long-term, that'll have a long-term impact by the Trump administration, and it's worked awfully well.
Well, thank you, Fred. Judge Starr, can you just tell us what you think is the import of how the judiciary is being remade?
We're talking about decades, not 2 years or 4 years. John Adams nominates John Marshall and as a midnight appointee. So before he leaves office in March of 1801, John Adams gets John Marshall confirmed as the third Chief Justice of the United States. People think he was the first. 2 years, and this was during, of course, the Jefferson administration, so John Adams has retired to Boston. These words are penned by John Marshall. It is emphatically the province of the judicial department to say what the law is. Let that register just for a second. So ours is the first truly written constitutional democracy of a vast commercial republic with judges having the last say. We didn't inherit that from the mother country. Parliamentary supremacy, it's only really in the last generation that European institutions, including the mother country's institutions, have shifted so that judges have the sort of authority that they've enjoyed from the very outset here in the United States. Now, John Marshall went on to serve until the mid-1830s. So think of that. So when a president is appointing a Supreme Court justice and is victorious, the president knows, and this goes to the point about youth, that if all goes well, I now have a Chief Justice for the next 30 years. Think of that. We have elections every 4 years, and yet, as it were, ruling from the grave, that the president can continue to rule from the grave. Another quick fact, in light of the size of the federal judiciary, and I want to echo what Fred has said about the importance of the courts of appeals and the United States District Court judges. The politics are different, but the importance is very profound. During an 8-year term, a president will appoint at least 40% of the sitting federal judiciary. That's what the statisticians will tell us, given longevity, retirement, and so forth. So one of the political things, were Carl here at the next table, he would say, we don't have the open Scalia seat, which galvanized so many people to say judges, but it wasn't just judges, it was who replaces, what president replaces Antonin Scalia. That captured, as Samuel Johnson said of a hanging, that wonderfully concentrated the Republican mind. We knew it counted. The American people knew that it counted. And how many people, have polls been done? So how many people said, I have reservations about candidate Trump, but I want him, everything else aside, to be the person who appoints the judges, but especially that seat.
Certainly, it was more than the 80,000 in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan who made the difference.
So I think that is a contextual point that just illustrates, frankly, the wisdom of the president as candidate, the wisdom of Mitch McConnell, and I think you're quite right to give him an enormous amount of credit, his, not just his wisdom, but his courage, because Mitch should tell the world, and he's said this somewhat publicly, but he's not been given enough credit for withstanding the pressure, including from some Republicans, to go ahead and hold hearings on the Merrick Garland, that this is wrong. You know, we were talking a lot about process, right? This is wrong and so forth, and yet we had it was a litigable issue, thank goodness, to Joe Biden once again, having
Joe Biden had given a speech on the floor of the Senate in, what was it, 1992, saying, oh, there's some rumors of one of the Supreme Court justices retiring. I just want to make it very clear that it would be completely unacceptable and we should not consider any Supreme Court nomination made in a presidential election year. And so all you had to do was take the Biden rule, and that was what McConnell did. But my question is this: why was it better to hold no hearings on Garland? Republicans controlled the Senate. Why not vote him down? Why would that have been inferior?
Well, what would you gain from that? You wouldn't gain anything politically. By having hearings, Judge Garland, who I'm sure you know is a very attractive guy and is a chief judge of the U.S. Appeals Court in Washington, D.C., it would have generated momentum to move the next step and actually confirm him. I mean, by the way it was said in the first place by Mitch McConnell, which he made this announcement on the day that Scalia died. He did not ask for any advice from other senators.
It was a Sunday. I remember. I was at Mass. It was a Sunday. Yeah.
It was. He did it on his own very quickly, and has said later, at least to me, but I think to others as well, that this is easily the single most important thing he's done in Washington as a senator. And of course, he has been a senator since 1984.
It would have further politicized the process because Merrick Garland was superbly qualified to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. So it wasn't surprising to me that President Obama would say, I'm anointing the chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, a brilliant judge and a very experienced judge and a person of integrity, and a liberal to fill that seat. The thing we had going for us, however, it was the seat of Antonin Scalia. So it was sort of, that's not fair, right? There was a sense, Justice Scalia didn't retire. He got overtired on his trip to Asia, goes hunting in Texas, and we lose him, right? So there was something odd about the entire thing. But it would have further politicized the process. I think it would have been very hard for some Republicans to have voted against him. Remember, or let me cite, you may not remember this, there's a reason you should. Ruth Ginsburg got over 90 votes for her confirmation. Stephen Breyer got 87 votes. My dear friends, things have changed. I wish we were in the good old days when it was a less political process, but we have passed that. We're no longer is the person qualified, have all the requisite qualifications, integrity and temperament and the like. It is now a deeply politicized process, and I think Mitch would have politicized the process further by saying, okay, perfectly qualified, but we're going to vote him down.
So speaking of politicized process, let's reopen the wound of Brett Kavanaugh's hearings here, which for me, in Washington, it really was a painful time. There were, I mean, friendships. Some of you guys might have lost friendships because you voted for Trump or you didn't vote for him or something. the same thing happened in Washington, where people said, "Tim, I thought you were a reasonable conservative until you supported Kavanaugh's confirmation." It was an ugly situation. So my first question is going to be, didn't the Democrats, and this comes from the audience, didn't the Democrats accomplish something by making it clear, if you step into that spotlight, they will inflict maximum damage and they will ruin your life? So a good person, because there's no perfect people, a good person with anything either in their past or that could be made up about their past is not going to want to step out there. So didn't they accomplish half of their goal?
No, I don't think so, because we're talking about the Supreme Court. We're not a lifetime appointment. Ken Starr has described it very importantly, and I'll let him elaborate on this. It is just it is such a unique position in America that I can't imagine somebody saying, if the president calls and says, "I'd like to nominate you," who would say no?
We've seen repetition of this. This is unfortunately the demonization of Brett Kavanaugh is not new. Neil Gorsuch managed to make it through without terrible personal pain. But shall we lift up again Clarence Thomas? And even though we tend to forget, because it was a bit of a tempest in a teapot, Sam Alito's confirmation, terribly ugly, and Martha, his wonderful spouse. I remember when, not to speak ill of the deceased, but Senator Ted Kennedy was going on quite a harangue, and is it Martha Ann Ellis? Martha Ann was so upset that she gets up, she's in tears, and she walks, and this is on television, I mean, we can pull it up, that they were so calumniating her husband. So the viciousness, we've talked about that a couple of times, and I've loved the sense that have come out of this, let's be kind and so forth. But the viciousness and nastiness and the demonization, we heard it first with Sarah yesterday, right? Just this nasty, intolerant kind of thing. And so I think it was the Clintons who came up with the term politics of personal destruction. That has infected the judicial process, but especially, not limited to, but especially the Supreme Court confirmation process. It's just, so it's an assumption of risk. If you get the nod, just be prepared and prepare your family. And it was painful to Alice and me to see this, because we know Brett so well, the justice. I served with him. He served in the independent counsel's office. We practiced law together. I hold him in the highest regard, and I hope, do you all approve of the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court of the United States? And the unfairness and ugliness, and the more we find out about the testimony, and I'm not going to speak ill of any witness, but the more we find out about the testimony of the key witness against him, the more questions, quite apart from no corroboration, right? No corroboration. The more that we find out, the more issues are being raised about the credulity of that witness.
Well, and let me add, before throwing it to you, Fred, it was also, I think, the single worst moment of the modern American press. It was the way that the major outlets would run totally the subsequent things after Chrissy Blasey Ford, the subsequent things that were totally not believable, that were coming from, there's no way that if somebody told a reporter, hey, yeah, this guy I know ran a rape gang in high school, that they would run with that if it were any situation other than this. And the factual errors, the total misleadingness, the playing along with Kamala Harris's games, I thought that my industry totally failed and abandoned its standards for that moment. And that's part of the reason that it was particularly painful for us. But I want to ask, so again, I'm a pro-life conservative. My family members who all voted for Trump, it was about Roe v. Wade. I'm also old enough to remember that Souter was supposedly going to be the guy who overturned Roe v. Wade. I know that Republicans, as many have voted, or at least 5 Republican nominees have upheld Roe v. Wade or voted for it in the first place. Planned Parenthood v. Casey had multiple Republican authors. Are we confident that Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts would either strike down or scale back the precedents in Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey? Neither of them wants to answer this.
No. I don't think anyone should be confident about any justice on any issue of great magnitude as an a priori matter, as opposed to you've got to listen to the arguments and so forth. Do they have premonitions or presuppositions going in? Because having been a judge, privileged to serve as a judge, you take seriously, and you hear this in the confirmation hearings, I have to remain open-minded. And that's why I cannot say to you, Senator, this is what my position is. And I take that with literal truth, that they will listen. Now, that having been said, whatever your view is in terms of abortion, its morality, and so on and so forth, Roe v. Wade was profoundly wrongly decided as a matter of constitutional law. So pro-choice Republicans can say, but I like Roe v. Wade because I like the policy that it embodies. My response to that is, but it is extraordinarily bad constitutional law. Just as you might agree as a libertarian, let freedom ring, equality, you might agree with the policy behind gay marriage. But it was not the province of the Supreme Court of the United States to issue that edict for all of us, because marriage law has historically been a matter entrusted to the states. Within reasons, you say, oh yes, the abolition or the prevention of interracial marriage. I understand that, but we fought a civil war and we have the 14th Amendment. Gay marriage was a completely different and distinguishable kind of issue. So, as Nino Scalia said in one of his last opinions, which was in the gay marriage case, in his mighty dissent, and I commend that to those who say, you know, why can't we just get along and go along with the culture and so forth? We're talking about something different. We're talking about the role of the courts in a constitutional democracy. And he said, I don't have strong feelings about the policy. In other words, he wasn't going to lose any sleep if Virginia, where he lived, brought in marriage equality. But he says, I care deeply about who decides that question. It's for we the people. That's a constitutional democracy as opposed to a rule by Platonic guardians.
I wanted to add one more thing about the Kavanaugh nomination. There was one thing that could potentially have stood in the way, and that was that he wouldn't have been picked by President Trump. One of the Trump obviously relied on Mitch McConnell and particularly on Don McGahn, his White House counsel, and he became great friends also with Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, who would meet often with Trump one-on-one, actually. And but there was one other person who Trump listened to, his sister. His sister was a judge, somewhat liberal, maybe you know her, on the Third Circuit, who
Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia, who was somewhat of a liberal, but she was one that Trump listened to. And one of the aides in the White House counsel's office told me that described her as the smartest member of the Trump family. Well, she had a fellow, a colleague on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals who she admired a lot, whose name I'm forgetting.
I'm drawing a blank. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah, anyway, and she had recommended him to her brother. And so when they got around to picking, this is after the Gorsuch nomination, to the Kavanaugh nomination, and Kavanaugh was really strongly supported by Don McGahn and by Leonard Leo and by a lot of people in the Washington conservative legal community. But this other fellow, whose name, oh God, it'll come to me sometime before we leave, was someone who had been a contender for the first nomination, the Gorsuch one. And he came and visited with the president in the Trump Tower and so on, and Trump liked him like crazy. 15 minutes after Gorsuch was thrown in, was actually sworn in by the president calls this judge on the Third Circuit and tells him, excuse me, how much he liked him and appreciated talking to him and so on, and left it at that. But so when we get around to the next nomination, he and they have a list of people that is given him of ones that the president ought to talk to before he picks this for this vacancy. The president says, well, we want to get this other guy in here, the guy he had called. And sure enough, he comes down to Washington and meets with the president again. And it looked like, well, maybe it won't be Kavanaugh. Maybe it'll be this other fellow. Well, it turned out to be Kavanaugh, but excuse me, it was a close call.
So, going forward, who, if he gets another vacancy, who would you guys nominate? If he said, okay, enough Leonard, enough all you other people are advising me, I'm calling Ken Starr and Fred Barnes to ask whom I should nominate. Who would you tell him?
Well, you know all these people.
Yeah.
The very good news is the bench is very, there are a lot of people who send into the mound. And an odds-on favorite, I believe, going in, you mentioned the Notre Dame Law School, would be Amy Coney Barrett of the Seventh Circuit in Chicago, who
Has 8 kids, I believe.
Say it again?
I think she has 8 children, so that's a vote. 8 votes in her favor in my book. So
I mean, she's a lovely person, and obviously is a mom, and is a very respected judge. And now she has the advantage of several years additional experience, because her name was bandied about quite seriously, because she does have the advantage of being a woman. She's from the Midwest, et cetera, and very, very respected as an academic, et cetera. So I think she's going to check literally all the boxes of those who will be advising the president. So I would put her near the top of the list, because he's done, let's face it, there are only 9 justices. What are the demographics? There are 2 white males that he's appointed, so I think that he would look just as Ronald Reagan did. You might say, well, why can't we just be gender neutral and so forth? Well, a long time ago, one Ronald Reagan, and there was a little bit of a gap, I think, gender gap in the election of 1980. Fred would know. But it wasn't that he was looking ahead to 1984. He felt, Ronald Reagan felt, and I was sufficiently old that I was present at the creation of all this, during those conversations, he felt that he had made a moral commitment to the American people based upon his sense of fairness, that there were plenty of qualified women able to go on. It's 1980, for Pete's sake. Let's go and get a highly qualified woman. So I think the politics would be quite influential, but I defer to Fred on that.
Well, no, I agree with that. The politics are good, and of any of the, particularly the women who have been mentioned as possible nominees for a third Trump Supreme Court pick, don't have the following around the country that Amy Barrett has, and I know plenty of people in Washington, lawyers, and not all of them are women by a long shot. But you'll remember Amy Barrett, when she was, I think it was her hearing before going on the 6th or 7th Circuit, whichever one it is, I forget the numbers. The 7th Circuit, which is Chicago and the Midwest, and where she is now a judge, that the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and several other members of the committee made an issue of her Catholicism.
yeah, Dianne Feinstein.
Dianne Feinstein being the chairman. But it wasn't just Dianne Feinstein. Several others chimed in about her Catholicism, that the thrust of it being was that basically she'd vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. And it was a pretty nasty hearing, as it turned out. And obviously, for Democrats and liberals, Roe v. Wade would be the center issue for them of an Amy Barrett nomination.
So Will a president ever again? We talked about Merrick Garland. If Republicans win the White House but lose the Senate, will Trump be able to put anybody on the court? And I'd ask the vice versa too. If Republicans hold the Senate but lose the presidency, will McConnell confirm anybody?
Well, you get a different kind of nominee. I mean, start with there being no Senate run by Republicans anymore, and Democrats in charge. It would be.
Trump would have to go off the list to get somebody confirmed.
The list would die. You wouldn't have a conservative list. You'd have you might not have a liberal list, but you'd have a moderate to liberal list, and this is how you wind up with David Souters.
And it's kind of what Obama was kind of thinking that with Merrick Garland. A, Garland was 65 or something, and B, he didn't seem as liberal as some of the picks.
And there was another thought with Merrick Garland that if Hillary had actually won, that she would not have been obligated to stick with Merrick Garland, that she would nominate somebody much more liberal. We'll never know. Thank God.
Well, I just had one factor, that is, what vacancy is it? Neil Gorsuch was able to withstand the slings and arrows, there weren't so many, because he was succeeding Antonin Scalia. However, look at the seat that Brett Kavanaugh was to occupy, that of the center vote, the pivotal vote, Tony Kennedy. So this was a fight to the death. If we go back in time, remember when Justice Powell steps down, that again, oh, here's a center seat. So what seat is being vacated? If Ruth Ginsburg goes, and I wish everyone long health and so forth, but if she is the next one to, for whatever reason, step down from the court, one would, I think President Trump at a second term would have, shall I say, greater flexibility, right? Because people say you're not going to change the ideological balance, so Mitch McConnell would not say, let's go to death to fight someone more moderate than President Trump would naturally be inclined to. So I think let's don't forget what seat is being vacated.
Ken mentioned that how many votes was it that Ruth Bader Ginsburg got? 93 votes. Republicans, there are a number of Republicans, and Lindsey Graham comes to mind. He's now the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, but he has mentioned during the Kavanaugh hearings how he thought, and there were other Republican senators, I think Orrin Hatch was one, who believed that a president, within reason, ought to get a nominee for the Supreme Court unless there was some a strong reason not to, some flaw in the person morally or something, or somebody who was way too liberal. And so they believed in voting for giving the president the benefit of the doubt. A Democratic president. Obviously, Democrats don't agree with that anymore.
That really was,
and really never did.
I thought the Kavanaugh confirmation was Lindsey Graham's finest moment in office by far. There are people like Susan Collins whose job it is to consider it all judiciously and lay out point by point the case after taking all the evidence into account. And there are people like Lindsey Graham whose job it is to punch the other guys in the face and let everybody know how awful they're being. So on the lower courts, I want to ask things that not everybody here is going to know the names of all 110 district courts and all district judges who are put in there, or 42 circuit court judges. Who are the sort of the most interesting, the most appealing, the most important judges that you guys have seen on the lower courts? I'll start with a good way to measure is how many votes against him did they get. Kyle Duncan down in Louisiana got 50 votes against him because he had been a litigator for religious liberty in the Hobby Lobby case. In other words, as they would put it, he campaigned against women's access to health care, and that all the social issues was a reason that he was so widely reviled, and he definitely had the right enemies, and he's down there in Louisiana on the court. Do you guys have?
Well, you'd mentioned Susan Collins, the senator from Maine, and she was in the beginning a dissenter on the Kyle Duncan nomination. He'd also been a lawyer for whoever was challenging, I think it was Louisiana's law against gay marriage. So there were several things there that bothered her a lot. And this shows both the patience and the persuasiveness of Mitch McConnell, who delayed a vote on Kyle Duncan for a long time. And if I suspect if Susan Collins hadn't gone along, there would never been a vote. Kyle Duncan would have been withdrawn. But Mitch McConnell spent an awful lot of time dealing with her and talking to her and trying to persuade her, and ultimately did persuade her to vote for Kyle Duncan, who I happen to have met and is a very impressive guy, but also fills the bill of he's under 50 and so on. Now, Susan Collins, of course, many people, including Mitch McConnell, says her speech that Tim referred to was the deciding thing in the Kavanaugh nomination. And I'll have to say, just personally, I had never met Susan Collins before that case came along. I'd never spoken a word to her. I mean, I've spent my whole life in Washington writing about a lot of this stuff. And I went to see her when I was doing a piece on Mitch McConnell. And I talked to some other senators as well, about 5 or 6 or 7 of them, and most of them would bring in when I'd go interview them, they'd bring in a team of press secretaries and communications directors and political advisors and so on. But when I went to see Susan Collins, it was just one-on-one. She didn't have any of her staff in there. And I spent an hour with her. And I'll have to say, to my surprise, that's one of the nice things about reporting is you get surprised a lot. Now maybe the ones who are better than I am don't get surprised, but I still do. And I was impressed with her, and I was so impressed with her speech. It was probably the best speech I've heard in the Senate in many, many years, no question about that. But she had done such a great job of dealing with every accusation against Brett Kavanaugh, told nobody about what she was doing. This was all done by
We were all
her.
watching it live, and the people were like looking at each sentence and tweeting out, like trying to interpret it live. It was like Kremlinology live as it was going on.
Well, Mitch McConnell didn't know what she was going to say in this speech, but Susan Collins told me when she had finished the speech and was going over to the Capitol from her office in one of the Senate office buildings, and she stopped in the Senate dining room to get a snack before going over there, thinking
for like
well,
peeking at her speech in her hand.
Yeah, and thinking there would be no senators there; they'd already be over there. Guess who was having lunch there? Mitch McConnell. So, and so he invited her to come and have lunch with him, and she had to tell him what she was going to do, and then she walked over and gave this speech, which is a memorable speech. If you didn't see it, you ought to watch it sometime. Susan Collins has a funny way of talking, but it certainly didn't seem funny when she gave that speech.
Is there anybody that you would advise people to keep their eyes on?
Yeah, the bench is extraordinarily deep, as I said before. Let me just stay in my own neck of the woods where Alice and I are blessed to live in the great state of Texas. The president has made a number of appointments to the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, which is our home circuit, and ditto for the 11th Circuit right here based in Atlanta. So I will mention sort of hometown favorites, but he was actually on the original expanded list, and that's Don Willett. Little bit of hometowning here, loyal Baylor alum, although went to the Duke Law School. But Judge Willett was a justice very respected on the Texas Supreme Court, appointed by President Trump to the Fifth Circuit. Jim Ho, H-O, as in ho-ho, really terrific lawyer, was Solicitor General of the state of Texas. We mentioned Kyle Duncan as we're heading east. There are two women, recent appointees to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit based in Atlanta. The point is, we could just keep going around the country. The president has an abundance of riches if he has this great opportunity.
Don Willett tweets.
He's given it up.
I gave it up.
He finally has given
He
it up.
was the funniest judge on Twitter, and
Yeah, that's not the way to get to the Supreme Court, though, to be the funniest judge.
Well, and he also had a critical tweet of President Trump. So here's a check mark in favor of President Trump, that even though he had one negative tweet about the president, which he shouldn't have done as a judge, but I mean, at the time, he was a Texas Supreme Court justice, but the president put him on the list, on the expanded list of potential Supreme Court nominees.
Well, a senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy, made a big issue of this and questioning Willett, and pumped him. I happened to go to that hearing and pumped him to get him to say, basically, to get on the appeals court, that he would stop tweeting then.
I'll never tweet again, but he did.
But he didn't
make
say
that
it.
commitment.
But and so Kennedy, actually, we had mentioned Kyle Duncan, this appeals court judge. Kennedy at first resisted Duncan's appointment in part, and this tells you something about the way it works. He in Louisiana, there was this deep bench of conservative judges, and Kennedy kind of was ready for the White House to call him and say, who should we go with? But the sort of Don McGahn Federalist Society world had said, Kyle Duncan's got to be your first. So for senators, one of the biggest crimes you can commit against a senator is to not consult with them before making a decision about their state. Am I right on that?
Yes, with this caveat, and I heard Howard Baker say this in 1981 when he was the newly installed Senate Majority Leader. And he said to the Attorney General, I was serving as Chief of Staff, to Bill Smith in the Reagan administration, and he said, General, from the time of George Washington, the senior senator in the president's party has determined who the district court, he drew the district court of appeals distinction. So that's where a Senator Kennedy from Louisiana would, if he was inclined to, and he did, bow to the force of history, would say, I determine who goes on the Eastern District of Louisiana and so forth. But for the Court of Appeals, that's a presidential call.
All right. To wrap up, one more question for each of you. So I want to, it's a kind of a two-part question for you, which is to say, how have Trump's picks made a difference already in decisions that have been made at the higher or lower, and where should we look for future decisions that will be incredibly important that you think Trump's picks will affect?
I think we all live in the shadow, and it's a happy shadow, of Antonin Scalia, who, when he went on to the Supreme Court in 1987, changed the course of debate in American law, and that is what we would call textualism. We can talk about originalism if we have time. We're all textualists now. Even those who might vote a different way on issues of same-sex marriage or what have you, abortion, the social issues, would say, yes, it was Nino's voice. He wasn't alone, but his was the most eloquent and powerful and consistent voice to saying the law matters, and we don't rewrite the laws. Just exactly what we were hearing from Senator Scott yesterday. This is the role of the judiciary. Let's stay in our lane and so forth. Let's don't try. As Nino said in a wonderful opinion, judges are not here to build a better world. They're to interpret the law. So Trump now, President Trump, stands in the tradition of Ronald Reagan and other Republican presidents who said judges should be judges. And the other thing I would say is because, and I want to again say to Fred, it's difficult to overestimate the positive from those of us who believe in judicial restraint and the vision of the judiciary that Alexander Hamilton lifted up in Federalist 78, the least dangerous branch, the branch where judgment is exercised but will is not imposed. For those of us who accede to that traditionalist vision, and it's not a, what shall I say? It is the right vision. It's the vision of Holmes and of Brandeis and of Marshall. This is our job. Yes, we're to interpret the law, the Constitution. Freedom of speech means freedom of speech. The Second Amendment means the Second Amendment. We're going to treat this document with reverence and honorably and honesty, with intellectual honesty, as opposed to making it up and building a better world. So let us just give credit to President Trump for staying in the tradition that the Federalist Society out on the hustings lifted up in the halls of courthouses, in law schools and so forth, that this is the way it is to be done. It's the tradition of Nino Scalia.
Thank you. Everybody, thank the panel for this great discussion. Thank you guys very much.
Great